The day had been long, the kind of day that pressed the weight of the world onto a man's shoulders and left little room for thought beyond survival. Elias Mercer trudged back toward his cabin with the slow, deliberate gait of one who had lived too many seasons in silence. His boots carried the dust of the range. His coat clung to him heavy with the mist of an approaching storm, and his hands, scarred, cracked, knotted from years of work, hung at his sides as though the earth itself had claimed them. When he pushed open the cabin door, expecting nothing but the stillness of his own loneliness, he stopped cold. There, standing by the hearth where the fire burned low, was a woman. She was wrapped in a torn shawl, its threads frayed like roots pulled from dry soil. Rain had darkened her braids, and her face was lit by the glow of flame and shadow. Her eyes met his, dark, unflinching, and yet carrying a tremor of fear beneath their surface. Elias's hand went at once to the rifle slung over his shoulder, though he did not raise it. His voice, when it came, was low and rasping from disuse. "Who are you?" The woman did not answer at first. The storm outside rattled the shutters, drumming against the roof as if heaven itself demanded entry. Only then did she speak, her words quiet yet unshaken, as though she had chosen each one with care. "I want to stay here, nothing more." The sound of her voice cut through the emptiness of the cabin like a knife through canvas. Elias felt the air catch in his chest. He was not a man accustomed to company, not since the earth had swallowed his wife and laid her in the small hilltop grave beneath the cedar tree. Loneliness had been his only companion these long years, a companion he had learned to obey like one obeys the slow pull of winter. Now here stood this woman, an Apache woman, by the look of her dress and the braids falling heavy over her shoulders. She did not lower her gaze. He saw both fear and defiance in her, two forces that could not be separated. Elias said nothing for a long while. He crossed the room, set his rifle against the wall, and pulled off his wet coat. The fire cracked as if to remind him he was still alive. He ladled stew from the pot that hung above the embers and placed it on the table. Then he gestured, not with warmth, but with the bare courtesy of survival. "Eat." The woman came forward slowly, as though each step tested whether this roof would hold her weight. She lowered herself at the table, hands trembling faintly as she wrapped them around the bowl. Elias watched her eat, slow, cautious, as though she feared the meal might be snatched away. He said nothing more, and neither did she. When she had finished, she drew the shawl closer around her shoulders and turned her face toward the fire. Elias sat down in the rocking chair that had once belonged to his wife. The wood creaked under him, a sound he had grown so used to that it no longer seemed strange to sit in the echo of her presence. He set his rifle across his lap, not in threat, but in habit. Outside, the rain thickened into a steady roar. The woman curled on the floor by the fire, her head bowed, her braid falling forward like a rope severed from its knot. Elias could not bring himself to ask her name. Names made things permanent, and permanence was dangerous. The storm carried into the night. The sound of the rain became a wall around them, shutting out the world beyond the cabin walls. Elias stared into the flames, the orange light painting shadows across his lined face. His thoughts drifted, back to the shawl folded in the cedar chest, his wife's shawl, woven with care, still smelling faintly of smoke and lavender. He wondered if it was betrayal to let another woman's breath warm this cabin. He looked at the figure sleeping by the fire. Her breathing had steadied, though her shoulders still curled inward, as if bracing against a world that had never shown her mercy. The rocking chair creaked again. He set one hand upon the worn wood of its armrest, fingers running across the grooves his wife's fingers had once touched. For a moment, grief swelled inside him, sharp and unrelenting. Then, just as suddenly, it ebbed. This was no invitation, he told himself. No welcome, no promise. Only survival. The woman had asked to stay, and he had not turned her out into the storm. That was all. Still, he felt the silence shift. It was no longer the silence of an empty cabin echoing with memory. It was the silence of two souls, both abandoned, both left behind, breathing under the same roof. One side of the cabin claimed by loss, the other by survival. Between them, the storm roared on, But inside there was something else, fragile, unnamed, a test of mercy. No more, no less. When Elias finally closed his eyes, the rifle still across his lap, he did not dream of the grave on the hill. He dreamed only of rain, emotional tone and realization, mistrust, loneliness, and the echo of abandonment. Elias realizes his solitude has been disturbed, but something fragile, a test of mercy, has begun. Morning came gray and restless, a light mist lying over the valley, the smell of damp earth thick in the air. Elias rose early, as he always did, though sleep had been broken and shallow. The storm had passed, but its weight still lingered, like grief that does not leave when the mourner is done weeping. He stepped outside into the chill, the boards of the porch groaning beneath his boots. Behind him, he heard the faint stirrings of movement within the cabin. He did not turn. The sun was only a pale streak above the horizon, and there was work to be done. The plow waited in the field, its handles smoothed by years of use, darkened by sweat and weather. Elias set his shoulders to the task. The land here was unforgiving, but he knew every stone, every stubborn root. His hands gripped the wood, and though the skin was hardened with callus, blisters still bloomed. The earth demanded payment, and Elias had never been a man to refuse her. From the corner of his vision, he caught the faint shape of the woman at the cabin door. She did not come down the steps. She stood with the shawl drawn close about her, watching him with an unreadable gaze. The sight of her there unsettled him more than he wished to admit. He thought of the cedar chest inside, of the shawl folded with care, the last garment of his wife that he had not been able to put away. Each time he opened that chest, the years rolled back, and grief clamped down like iron. Now another woman breathed under his roof, her breath mingling with the air that had once belonged to another. Was this betrayal? The question gnawed at him, though no answer came. By mid-morning, his body ached from the labor, and sweat clung cold against his shirt, despite the cool wind. He paused only long enough to feed the horse, stroking the animal's neck with a gentleness that came easier than words. The woman, he still did not know her name, watched from the porch, her hands clasped before her as though to keep them from trembling. Inside her, memories pressed hard. Naili remembered fire sweeping through the camps, the cries of women carried into the night, the echo of hooves and rifles. She remembered the soldier's hand that had pulled her by the braid, the faces of her people scattered like leaves before the wind. Every scar upon her body spoke, though silently. Now she stood still and studied this man, this rancher with grief in his eyes and silence in his bones. She noticed the limp in his step, the scar that cut like an old river down the line of his jaw. She saw the way he gave his horse a portion before feeding himself, and how he set his shoulders not with pride but with endurance. He bore loss differently than she did, but loss nonetheless. Through the long day, they spoke no words. The distance between them remained, but it was no longer a distance of hostility. It was the space of two broken branches fallen from the same storm. Evening drew in slow, the valley painted with blue shadows. Elias returned to the cabin weary, his hands raw, his face drawn. The fire was already lit inside, its warmth spilling into the room with the faint crackle of burning oak. He sat heavily in the rocking chair, drawing out his knife and a block of wood. With steady strokes he carved, the blade whispering against the grain. Across the room, Nayeli crouched low with strips of leather in her lap. Her fingers moved with memory's rhythm, weaving thin strands into something useful, something orderly. The glow of the fire touched her face, caught the shine of her braid as it slid forward over her shoulder. She did not look at him, but the silence between them was softer now, as though the cabin itself had learned to breathe differently. Elias's knife moved slow. He thought of the days when this room had been filled with another presence, the sound of laughter, the rustle of fabric, the scent of bread baked in the small iron oven. Now those memories came not with sharpness but with dull ache, a constant murmur at the edges of thought. The woman before him was not his wife, nor could she ever be. Yet still, she was here, and the firelight drew her nearer into the shape of his reality. Nayeli's thoughts turned as her fingers wove. The leather was worn, scavenged from old straps and belts, but she worked it into new form. That was survival, to take what had been torn and make it whole again. She did not know if she would remain, if tomorrow he would drive her from this place, but tonight there was firelight and the sound of his blade against wood. Tonight there was not only absence but presence. The silence lengthened, but it was no longer hostile. It had taken on the shape of something else, like two ghosts learning they were not alone, bound not by choice, but by the simple fact of endurance. At last Elias set down the wood, the shape only half formed in his hand. He looked toward her, but she did not meet his eyes. He thought for a fleeting moment of asking her name. The words rose but did not pass his lips. Some things, he reasoned, were better left for another day. The fire cracked, sending sparks upward. Beyond the cabin walls, coyotes called to one another across the valley, their voices thin and haunting. Inside, the two sat in silence, each haunted by shadows too heavy for speech. Yet in that silence, something faint stirred, the recognition that broken lives could sit beneath the same roof without shattering further. Emotional tone and realization, the weight of memory. Both are haunted by loss of tribe, loss of family, loss of belonging. A hesitant recognition begins. Broken lives can sit in the same room without shattering further. The storm came sudden, as if the mountains had decided to loose their anger all at once. By mid-afternoon, the sky had darkened to the color of slate, clouds heaving low and swollen. The wind whistled sharp through the gaps in the eaves, rattling the shutters like bones in a box. Snow mingled with sleet, striking the cabin walls in hard, uneven bursts. Elias braced the door with his shoulder, shoving it closed against the force of the gale. "Hold," he muttered, though whether to the door, the storm, or himself, he did not know. The cabin groaned under the weight of weather, the roof already dripping in thin, stubborn trails. He moved to fetch a bucket, his limp slowing him, but when he turned back, Naomi was already there. Her shawl clung heavy with damp where she had gone out for wood earlier. Without waiting for instruction, she bent to gather the kindling into tighter bundles, her braid slipping loose, strands of dark hair whipping against her cheek. She worked quick, her movements sharp with memory, as though she had battled storms before and knew they gave no second chances. Elias paused, watching. For the first time since her arrival, she did not simply endure under his roof. She labored beside him. He found himself muttering less, his steps falling into rhythm with hers. They patched leaks with tarred cloth, pressed weight against the shutters, fed the fire as the wind howled outside. No words were spoken, yet their silence carried a different weight now, like the sound of two axes striking different trees in the same forest, separate but echoing together. By nightfall, the storm's fury had sharpened. Snow and sleet drove so hard they blurred the world beyond the window into white nothingness. Elias sat near the fire, rubbing his hands, the ache in his knuckles deep and throbbing. Naomi placed more wood upon the flames, her face lit by its glow, her shadow stretching long across the cabin wall. Then, faint at first, but undeniable, came the sound of hooves. Elias stiffened. His hand went at once to the rifle propped by the chair. Outside, beyond the roar of the storm, came the uneven crunch of a horse forcing its way through drifts. He rose, rifle in hand, his body tense with the knowledge that the storm itself might not be their only adversary tonight. A knock struck the door, loud, impatient. Elias drew in a breath, steadying himself. He opened the door only a fraction, the wind rushing in sharp as knives. Through the white curtain of sleet, a figure sat astride a horse, his oilskin slick with frost. "Mercer," the man called, voice sour and cutting. "That you in there?" Elias squinted. He knew that voice. Mr. Hanley, a neighbor whose land butted against his. A man quick with suspicion and quicker with his tongue. "What's your business, Hanley?" Elias asked, voice steady, though his heart thudded hard. Hanley leaned in the saddle, his eyes sharp beneath the brim of his hat. "Saw smoke rising late. Saw tracks too, smaller than yours. Don't tell me you've taken on company, Mercer." "Strange time for it." Elias held the door firm, his rifle angled just out of sight. Storm's no time for questions. Hanley gave a sharp laugh that carried no mirth. Maybe, but folks talk, Mercer. Talk about raids. About strays running loose in the hills. You'd best keep your place clean. His gaze lingered past Elias, as if he could see through the cracks and shadows into the cabin itself. Inside, Nayeli crouched low by the fire, her body taut. One hand clutched a knife she had pulled from the table, her knuckles pale around its handle. The fire cracked behind her, throwing sparks upward, but she did not flinch. Elias shifted, filling the doorway with his frame. "Nothing here but me, Hanley. You know I've no stomach for gossip." For a long moment the two men stared at one another, the storm howling between them. Hanley narrowed his eyes, spat into the snow, then tugged his reins. "See that it stays that way," he muttered. With a jerk of his horse he vanished into the white squall, swallowed by the storm's fury as suddenly as he had come. Elias closed the door and set the bar against it, his hands trembling though his face gave nothing away. He turned. Nayeli still crouched low, the knife in her hand, her chest rising and falling with quick, shallow breaths. Their eyes met. For the first time, Elias saw not only fear in her gaze, but trust, unspoken, fragile and sharp as glass. He lowered his rifle, setting it back against the chair. "He's gone." Nayeli did not answer at once. Slowly she eased the knife back onto the table. The storm roared outside, but inside the cabin the silence thickened, filled with the unspoken truth that danger had come near and passed them by. They both sank close to the fire, as though its warmth alone might shield them from the memory of the knock at the door. The flames hissed and spat, throwing light across their faces. Elias rubbed his hands again, but his eyes stayed fixed on hers. He saw there not only fear, but hunger, a hunger he knew too well. The hunger to belong somewhere, to be permitted to remain, if only for one night longer. She drew the shawl tight around her shoulders and looked at him across the flames. For a moment, the wind outside did not exist. The storm could not touch them. They were two souls bound by the same secret, the same danger pressing at their walls, and the fragile warmth of their shared defiance. The rocking chair creaked. Elias leaned back slowly, exhaling a breath he had not known he was holding. He thought of Hanley's eyes, sharp with suspicion, and of the rifle in his hands. More than that, he thought of the woman by the fire, her shadow long and unbroken against the wall. He realized then, he had chosen. Chosen to shield her, though the cost was yet unknown, and Nayeli, meeting his gaze, realized something too. The cabin was no longer only refuge from rain or snow. It might be something more, a second chance, fragile as flame, but real enough to warm the bones. Emotional tone and realization. Suspicion and danger brush close, forcing trust. Elias realizes he is willing to shield her from men like Hanley. Nayeli realizes the cabin may be more than a refuge. It might be a second chance. Days passed into weeks, though the days themselves blurred into one another like brushstrokes across a canvas of muted colors. The storm faded, winter loosened its grip, and the valley crept toward spring, though frost still rimmed the mornings and smoke still rose nightly from the chimney. Within the cabin, Elias and Nayeli fell into an uneasy rhythm. He rose before dawn, as he always had, to tend to the animals, his limp slowing but never halting him. She moved quietly in his absence, gathering water, tidying the hearth, mending the shirts whose cuffs had frayed with years of wear. When he returned, they shared the silence like a cup set between them, both drinking from it, neither breaking it more than necessary. It was a silence not of hostility, but of endurance. Yet little by little cracks opened in it. She thanked him softly one morning when he placed coffee before her. He gave a brief nod when she returned from the creek with water sloshing in the pail. Once, when she set bread upon the table, he muttered, almost without meaning to, "Good." Small things, barely words, yet they shifted the air between them. Still, beneath the roof, tension lingered. Elias knew it well, the danger of whispers. In town, men spoke of shadows moving in the hills, of savages too stubborn to surrender. Soldiers rode more frequent patrols, their boots pounding into the mud with a sound that carried far. Every rumor was a knife that might yet cut into his home. At night, when the fire burned low, Elias often sat in the rocking chair, the rifle leaning close. His eyes drifted toward the cedar chest in the corner. Within it lay his wife's wedding dress, folded in perfect silence, yellowed with years, but sacred still. He would open the chest sometimes, just to see it. To remember? The fabric whispered of vows spoken and laughter shared, of hands that once held his without trembling. Now another woman's presence lingered in that same air. Elias felt guilt sharpen inside him. Each breath Nayeli drew seemed to press against a memory he had thought sealed away. He told himself again and again, she is not here to replace, only to survive. But guilt was stubborn. It did not listen. One afternoon, when the sun laid its pale light across the floorboards, Nayeli stumbled upon the chest. Elias had left it slightly ajar, careless in his distraction. Drawn by curiosity, she lifted the lid and saw the folded dress. She froze, her hand hovering but not daring to touch. The fabric seemed to glow with a life that was not hers. Shame swept over her like a tide. She was an intruder in another woman's shadow, a trespasser in the place of a ghost who could never be forgotten. That evening she was quiet, quieter than usual, her eyes lowered. Elias noticed but said nothing. Words were not his strength, and he feared that if he tried, he would break what fragile peace remained. Yet there were moments when the silence was not only heavy, but tender. One evening, when his leg ached from too much labor, he winced as he sat. Without asking, Nayeli moved closer, her hand steadying his arm. Her touch was firm, not soft, but it steadied him more than he expected. He did not pull away. Another night, as she worked leather into thin braids, she hummed a tune beneath her breath. The sound was low, almost swallowed by the crackle of the fire, yet Elias heard it. The melody was foreign, yet its cadence soothed something restless in him. It was not the song his wife used to hum. It was something different, something belonging only to her. He found himself listening longer than he intended. Nayeli, for her part, fought her own shadows. Each kindness he showed, small though it was, felt like something dangerous. Did it mean she belonged here? Or was it only pity, a temporary shelter that could vanish with a single word? She feared never being welcome, feared being cast out when his guilt grew too heavy. Yet when she saw him struggle, when she watched him bear pain without complaint, something inside her shifted. Recognition, not of love, not yet, but of shared aloneness. Two people cut adrift by loss, bound by the quiet courage to remain alive. One evening, Elias set aside his carving and looked across the fire at her. She sat with her braid falling over her shoulder, her hands busy with thread and leather. The flames painted her features in gold and shadow. For a long moment he simply watched. Then he spoke, his voice low, almost uncertain. "You've seen loss. It was not a question." She looked up, her eyes meeting his, and for the first time she answered with more than a word or two. "Yes," she said, her voice steady, though her gaze drifted toward the fire. "And you," he nodded once, nothing more. Yet that single word between them carried weight, as though the silence had bent to make space for it. The rocking chair creaked. The fire burned lower. Outside, coyotes cried to the moon. Inside, they sat in a silence reshaped, not the silence of strangers, but of two who had acknowledged the depth of each other's wounds. Elias still wrestled with guilt, still felt the pull of the chest and the dress folded within it. Nayeli still feared the edge of rejection. Yet both, in their quiet way, began to understand. Survival was not only food and shelter. It was dignity, it was touch. It was the courage to stay when leaving might seem safer. Emotional tone and realization. Longing and restraint. Elias wrestles with guilt over letting another woman near his grief. Nayeli wrestles with the fear of never being welcome. Both realize survival is not just food and shelter. It is dignity, touch, and the courage to stay. Spring edged into the valley with the slow patience of a weary traveler. Snow thinned on the ridges. Green tips of grass pressed through thawing earth, and the creek behind the cabin began to sing again with meltwater. Elias noticed the changes in the land the way he always had, measured, quiet, unspoken. But this year the turning of the season carried something sharper, a sense that time was running thin. Danger rode with spring. Whispers from town reached even the furthest homesteads. Men muttered of raids, of cattle gone missing, of soldiers restless for a reason to act. And at the heart of it all sat Mr. Hanley, sour-tongued and sharp-eyed, his voice dripping suspicion. Elias had seen the way the ranch hands laughed when Hanley spoke, the way their eyes cut toward him. They were not laughing at jokes. They were laughing at the hunt. One night, when the moon hung like a thin coin in the sky and the air smelled of thawing mud, danger came pounding at his gate. The sound of hooves thundered up the dirt road, breaking the fragile quiet of the cabin. Elias was already rising from his chair before the dogs barked. He took the rifle from its resting place and stepped onto the porch, his limp barely slowing him. The night air bit cold, though the earth itself was warming. Riders emerged from the darkness, 6 men, the ranch hands of Hanley. Their horses stamped and snorted, their riders drunk with whiskey and malice. Torches bobbed in their fists, firelight licking the night. One man, thick in the shoulders and slurred in his speech, called out first, "Mercer! Hanley says you're keeping something that don't belong to you." Another chimed in, voice jeering. "Word is you got yourself a squaw. Hand her over, old man, and we won't trouble you further." The laughter that followed was ugly, the kind of laughter that hid fear with cruelty. Elias tightened his grip on the rifle, raising it just enough to make his meaning clear. "She's not yours to take," he said, voice steady. The men shifted in their saddles, their bravado clashing with unease. One spat into the dirt. Another swung his torch lazily toward the barn, where the smell of hay and wood hung thick. "Then maybe we torch your place," the first man growled. "Barn first, house next. See if that Indian's worth more to you than your livelihood." Tension crackled like lightning. Elias's finger rested against the trigger, but his heart pounded not with the fear of death. He had long ago made peace with the idea, but with the dread of losing the fragile trust he had built inside that cabin. The fire, the silence, the moments shared with Nayeli, all of it felt balanced on the edge of a knife. Inside, Nayeli clutched the shawl she had found weeks ago, the one that had belonged to Elias's late wife. She had draped it over her shoulders now, not as theft, but as armor, as if the fabric carried a strength she could borrow. Her body trembled, but her eyes burned. By the fire, she gripped the small knife she had kept hidden, though she knew it would be nothing against men on horseback with torches and guns. From the porch, Elias lifted his voice again, louder this time. "You come near this place, you'll not leave whole." The night went still. Even the horses seemed to sense the edge in his tone. For a long, taut moment, the riders wavered. Then one of them barked a curse, spat in the dirt, and yanked his reins. "Not worth it," he muttered, turning his horse. One by one, the others followed, their torches fading into the black of the valley, their laughter trailing like smoke. Only when the sound of hooves had fully disappeared did Elias lower the rifle. His shoulders sagged, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. His body trembled, not from fear of the gunfight that hadn't come, but from something deeper, the realization of how close he had come to losing what fragile peace had begun to bloom between himself and the woman inside. He turned back into the cabin. The door shut with a solid thud. Nayeli still sat by the fire, shawl wrapped tight, knife clenched in her hand. Her eyes met his, wide but steady. For a moment neither spoke. The crackle of the fire filled the silence. Then, her voice, low, almost inaudible. "You did not give me away." Elias set the rifle down, leaning it against the wall. He eased himself into the rocking chair, exhaling as though the air itself carried his exhaustion. His gaze met hers, and in it was no hesitation. "You belong here," he said. His voice broke slightly, then steadied. "More than they ever will." The words hung in the air, as fragile and dangerous as any gunshot. Nayeli drew the shawl closer, not as a shield now, but as something warm. Her eyes softened, though they did not lose their fire. They sat there for a long while, the flames painting their faces in shifting gold and shadow. Outside, the night still carried the echoes of hoofbeats. Inside, the silence no longer divided them. It wrapped around them both, a silence of shared defiance, of trust earned by fire. For Elias, the trembling in his hands eased, replaced by a strange calm. He had stood for her, not from pity, not from obligation, but because some part of him knew her presence was no accident. Protecting her was not betrayal of memory, it was the honoring of it. For Nayeli, the fear in her chest loosened, replaced by a fragile hope. She had been given away before, cast aside, hunted, treated as less than human. But here, tonight, when the world demanded she be surrendered, Elias had refused. And in that refusal was a truth. She might yet belong. By the firelight, with danger still lurking in the dark, the first fragile spark of love flickered to life. It was not passion, not yet. It was something deeper, something harder to extinguish. It was trust, emotional tone and realization, fear, defiance, and breakthrough. Both realize their bond is no accident. Elias sees dignity in protecting her. Nayeli sees hope in staying. Love begins not with passion, but with trust and shared defiance. The pounding came at dawn, not the light tap of a traveler seeking coffee by the fire, nor the jeering calls of Hanley's hands looking for trouble. This sound was heavier, official, a gauntlet of fists against wood and the stamp of hooves in the yard. Elias rose from his chair, his old bones warning him of the day's wait before he even reached for his rifle. Outside, the yard was filled with dust and uniforms. Soldiers in blue stood stiff-backed, rifles resting at their sides, while behind them gathered settlers, some clutching torches though the sun had barely cleared the ridge. Hanley was among them, his mouth curled in a smirk, eyes glittering with triumph. The officer stepped forward, boots crunching gravel. "Mercer," he barked, "you're harboring an Apache woman. She is not permitted here. By law, she must return to the reservation." Elias felt the air in his chest tighten, as if every sorrow he had ever carried had returned at once. He remembered the grave where his wife lay, the years of silence in this cabin, the long nights of rocking alone with only the creak of the chair for company. And then he remembered the woman now standing inside, shawl wrapped tight, who had spoken with fire in her eyes. "I want to stay here." He raised his voice, steady though his hands ached around the rifle. "She is no thief, no trespasser. Survival is not theft. Dignity cannot be given away," a murmur spread among the settlers. Some spat, others shifted uneasily. The officer's jaw hardened. "She is government property now," the man said. "Our orders are clear." At that word, something in Elias snapped like dry timber. He took one step down the porch, the limp in his leg plain, but his gaze unbroken. "She belongs to no one but herself," he said. "And if you think to take her, you'll have to burn this place and bury me first." For a long, breathless moment, the yard brimmed with danger. Fingers brushed rifle stocks. The air stank of horse sweat and smoke. Nayeli stood just inside the doorway, unseen but listening, her breath sharp in her chest. She held the shawl close, her eyes burning with tears she refused to let fall. The standoff stretched. Elias did not lower his rifle. He did not flinch. The officer, at last, looked into the face of a man who had already buried love and had nothing left to lose, except the fragile bond that gave his days meaning again. "Enough," the officer muttered finally, signaling his men back. His voice was clipped, unwilling to admit defeat. "But this isn't over, Mercer. You've set yourself against the law. We'll be watching." They turned, soldiers wheeling their mounts, settlers muttering and spitting as the crowd dispersed into dust and hoofbeats. Hanley lingered, eyes narrowed in hate, before he too pulled away. When the yard was empty, Elias lowered the rifle. His arms trembled, not with fear but with the weight of what had nearly been lost. He turned toward the door. Nayeli was there. She had not moved from the shadows, her shawl clutched like a shield. But her eyes met his with something fierce and unyielding. She did not thank him. She did not need to. Her silence spoke more than words. That night, the cabin's fire burned steady, though neither of them found sleep easily. Elias sat once more in the rocking chair, the creak familiar yet changed, no longer the sound of loneliness, but of choice. Nayeli rested near the hearth, her braid trailing over her shoulder, her breathing even. The silence between them was no longer heavy. It was shared, a silence of two lives that had touched and held fast. The next morning, Elias made a choice. He saddled the mare, polished the rifle, and filled his pockets with cartridges. Then he turned to Nayeli. "We ride to town," he said. Not as prey, not as quarry, but side by side. For a moment she hesitated. Then she nodded once, pulling the shawl about her shoulders, her chin high. The road into town was long, lined with dust and whispers of spring. Elias rode steady, his frame upright despite the limp, while Nayeli walked beside the horse, refusing to ride. Her dignity was in each step, deliberate, unbroken. They entered the town together, drawing eyes from doorways and windows. Whispers followed like the hiss of snakes. "That's her. Mercer's lost his wits. Ought to run them both out." But Elias kept his head high, and Nayeli's steps never faltered. They did not argue, did not explain. Their presence was their answer. By the time they passed the church and the general store, the whispers dulled, as though the town itself could not decide whether to condemn them or simply watch. By afternoon they returned to the valley, leaving the town and its judgments behind. The cabin waited, weathered but steadfast. Smoke rose once more from its chimney, a sign not of secrecy, but of life lived openly. That evening, as the sun bled red across the ridges, Elias sat again in his rocking chair. The rifle rested against the wall, unused, and the fire glowed steady on the hearth. Nayeli moved about the room with quiet purpose, placing a kettle, folding the shawl, tending to small tasks as though she had always been there. For the first time in years, the cabin no longer felt divided, one side loss, the other survival. Now it held both, grief and healing, silence and song, memory and new breath. Elias looked across the room at her. She caught his gaze, and though no words passed, something unspoken bound them, an understanding that home was not only inherited, but chosen. Outside, the wind rustled the budding branches. Inside, the rocking chair creaked, and the fire glowed. And in that quiet, Elias Mercer and Nayeli, two souls the world had cast aside, found not just survival, but the dignity of choosing one another. Emotional tone and realization, resolution, quiet triumph, healing. Elias realizes love can be a second chance, not a betrayal. Nayeli realizes home can be chosen, not only inherited. Together, they embody survival, dignity, and unspoken love.